if Jesus would dine and associate himself and scandalize the Pharisees by going to the house of a tax collector and reclining there and being there and calling one of them as his disciple, what about now? Is this the modern equivalent where if you do go to a gay wedding, are you following an example that Jesus would have done if he were here at this time? Welcome back to Jesus versus America. Jesus told us we couldn't follow two masters. So many of us are trying to follow the American culture while trying to follow Jesus. I'm John, and I'm joined by my good friends Monique and Wisdom. Together, we represent three generations that are trying to faithfully follow Jesus. It gets harder and harder when you mix those two things together. And so in this podcast, we're going to be asking the questions that many young adults ask. In fact, I've been asked this question many, many times in my years in ministry. Would Jesus attend a gay wedding? Or somebody has come up and said, should I attend a gay wedding? And of course, my answer is, well, if Jesus would, then you should. And if he wouldn't, then you shouldn't if you follow Jesus. At the outset of this episode, I'm going to say a couple things. The first is you might have clicked on this episode just because you want to know the answer, and you're going to make a judgment about this entire podcast, maybe our entire project, based on the answer to this one question. You might say, if they say that he would go, I'm out. You might say, if they say he wouldn't go, I'm out. What we're going to ask you to do is take the same posture that we're taking, which is to ask questions in this episode because there's a lot of confusion here. And the more I studied this week, the more confused I got. I want to start with an incident that happened recently that has the kind of the academic and scholarly evangelical world in a tizzy. And that is the story of Alistair Begg, who's a conservative pastor in Ohio. And he's the author of many books. He's been clear about his position that he is not in favor of gay marriage. But recently, in an interview last fall where he was talking about one of his books or a question that somebody asked him, he responded in a way that caused the entire conservative side of evangelicalism to cancel him and come out with all sorts of articles denouncing his position, or at least trying to draw lines of their own to clarify why they don't agree with him. It's a curious thing. Almost nobody would have known about this, but as soon as it was heard, it became a thing because everybody needed to state their position. And more than that, he was on a radio show for many, many years. That got canceled, right? Because of this one statement. I'd like to actually read the excerpt from the interview so we all know what we're saying, and I'm doing it in his own words. So he was asked this question by somebody that was looking for pastoral advice. He says, my grandson is about to be married to a transgender person, and I don't know what to do about this. And I'm calling to ask you to tell me what to do. And he says, this is a huge responsibility on him to answer this question. And in a conversation like that just a few days ago, and people may not like this answer, he said, but I asked the grandmother, does your grandson understand your belief in Jesus? She said, yes. He says, does your grandson understand your belief in Jesus makes it so that you can't countenance in affirming the choices that he's made in his life? The grandmother said, yes. And so Alistair said, I said, well, then okay. As long as he knows that, then I suggest that you go to the ceremony. And I suggest that you buy them a gift. Oh, she said, what? She seemed caught off guard. I said, well, here's the thing. Your love for them may catch them off guard, but your absence will simply reinforce the fact that these people probably think that you're judgmental, critical, unprepared to countenance anything. And then he comments on his own statement. He says, we're going to have to take the risk a lot more if we want to build bridges into the hearts and lives of those who don't understand Jesus and don't understand that he is a king. That was the sum total of that statement, which caused this incredible controversy. And
crazy to me that statement is so controversial.
And that's what we want to start with before we even get to what Jesus might or might not do.
Building bridges, the love, and it still sounds so conservative. Well, does he know where you stand? Yeah. And all, cross those T's and dot those I's. And she's like, yes. Still, like, that seems so conservative. Okay, well, go, because love and building bridges, and that got him canceled.
And I hear all the time about this woke cancel culture, and it is so interesting to me that nobody can cancel somebody faster than conservatives on the evangelical
They're not ready to hear that.
Yeah.
I mean,
really
it took like hours. I mean, this is incredible. Like they, if he didn't recant the statement, they asked, he said, "I stand by what I said," right? And it's clear he's on the record as somebody who does not support these marriages, but he's saying, if it's a family member and
from
they
a
know
moral
where you
standpoint.
stand. Yeah, well, from his biblical standpoint, like whatever his reason is, like we're not going to go into what his reasons are. He's just saying, I'm clear that I don't support these marriages, but I'm saying to you as a family member, if they clearly know where you stand, you
And
can
still
go.
wanted to invite you.
Right. As long as they know where you stand, you might surprise them by going. In other words, I think he's saying to them, like, your presence is not going to be misconstrued in any way because they know where you stand. It's not going to think, oh, they must have changed their mind. They're going to think they came anyway. So the question, though, really isn't, is this position right or wrong? I think the bigger question is, and this is confusing to me and it just grieves me, like, how does this create such a controversy when you say something, and why is it that everyone needs to draw these lines and be so rigid to make sure that nobody had to write a response to this. Even if the radio show canceled them, like, you didn't have to have like 25 articles coming out, like everybody stating their position and trying to correct his position. Like, what is it about this issue or just about anybody deviating from this very, very narrow orthodoxy that requires everybody to restate their positions?
Yeah. And as you were speaking, to me, it's almost like the Pharisees, which Jesus was obviously not in support of the way that we always talk about, the bad guy in the Bible. Oftentimes it's the Pharisees. And one of the things is the Pharisees had to outwardly present their faith, right? It wasn't about the state of their actual heart. It was like image and the way that they would pray, and they would wear religiosity as like a badge of honor or something. And so it's interesting to draw that parallel because it's very similar. And I think when you were asking, like, where does this come from, this like idea to have to draw a line? And I think it's sort of through the game of telephone that we were talking about, that when people don't really read the Bible or understand it, and they kind of hear of a passage and it goes in it, and they talk about it, remember that passage, and it's somehow transformed and the meaning is lost. But I think a lot of listeners will recognize this. People will say, God has told you to stand up for what is right publicly. And the passage they're actually using and twisting is the passage where Jesus says, like, if you deny my name, like, publicly, then I'll deny your name in front of my Father, which has nothing to do with, like, take a public moral stance on every freaking thing or you can't get into heaven. It's and you could talk about that more if you want to. That passage means something different. But I think part of it comes from that, because they're not even really quoting the verse the way it's supposed to be. It's like, God calls us to stand for that. And I'm just like, where are you getting that? So there's this weird belief that people think is biblical, where you have to like publicly posture yourself in favor or against, regardless if it is something that could be a gray area or not. It doesn't matter. You have to publicly stand there in order to be justified.
But it's not even like publicly disagreeing with him. Why are they canceling the guy altogether? The extremities to which they're like cutting him off. Like, this is Alistair Begg is a pretty well-known guy with teaching, with so many resources that he's produced over the years, and he's gained a pretty hefty following. And for something like that, which I don't even think is so...
Because he's not publicly standing in the way that they want him to stand.
But it's a specific that. I wonder if he had said something else that somebody might have disagreed with.
Divorced people.
Yeah, like it's a specific thing. Like, he might have said, well, I don't know about this one doctrine. I wouldn't live or die on this one doctrine. Like, maybe there's room for interpretation of the Bible. I don't know, they would have canceled, but on this one thing, as it seems like this is the one. He
lost his radio show?
Well, they shut it down, and the radio show basically said, like, we can't really have him on because of his view. And we had listeners calling and all these kinds of things. And you just think, all right, so that's one thing, so radio just says we're not going to host him. We're not going to platform him again. But just what caught me was the number of people who came out with articles. And again, I think most people at the common level probably weren't even paying attention to this story. It just caught me because my news feed, filled up with all these different people commenting on it at the more like pastoral, academic, scholarly level, everybody trying to take positions. And there's where we draw lines and not, I don't know where the love is. It's just the lines are more important than the love in some way. But I'm trying to figure out why, not just why this issue, but why this need to always make sure there's them and us and where I stand. Because it is very much like the Pharisees. I think it is an outward expression. It's like, we decry things like virtue signaling and we decry like cancel culture. And yet that's exactly what this is.
100%.
When you write an article saying, I respectfully disagree with him on these reasons, thinking, nobody asked you, like, why are you doing that? You almost need to like send out your own virtue signaling to the culture that I need to like do this,
what
right?
It is.
I mean, one person, two people could say, well, we disagree or we have this view that differs. Like, yeah, we know that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's even saying, I think he even said later, like, I would give the same advice, but I could be wrong, right? I'm just saying this to this person. And I think that's what makes it just remarkable. It's not the advice, but just the reaction or the need to virtue signal and send these things out and make sure everybody understands where the line is. And there's a fear in it, right? Like if we let people just go a little bit, that's it. The whole thing falls apart. The whole thing comes undone.
It's also just one more, and regardless how you feel about the LGBTQ community or like, an LGBTQ wedding, regardless of how you feel about that, it's just one more obvious public sign that for some reason the church cares about this one issue more than any other, because I can't imagine anyone being like, so I'm going to this wedding, but the bride didn't wait before she was married to have sex. Like, should I attend that wedding? The groom, like, for sure has lusted. I know he has, or maybe he struggled with like lust or like, porn or whatever it is. Everyone, I'm sure, is lusted at some point in their life. Should I go to that wedding? Like, am I supporting his sin if I go to this wedding? This person's second marriage, they're divorced. Should I go to a second marriage, a wedding that's a second? Nobody's asking those questions. We don't like care about that, right? But for some reason, we have to publicly stand, attack, denounce, whatever it is, that specific community. And it almost sends the message that like, God doesn't want you. God doesn't care about you. We don't want you. We don't want you around. Your heart doesn't matter. You have nothing of value to add to faith. It's a horrible, ugly, un-Christ-like thing. And I don't understand it.
Well, I'll give you the other side briefly. Like, I think some people, and this is an assumption that people make, that's a generous assumption because I don't think it's always true. When people go to that wedding where you go, I know he was struggling with pornography, or I know that he's been in an adulterous relationship. He might still be in one right now, but we're still going on. Or they've been cohabitating for a long time, but now, thank God, we'll just put them together and it'll all be over.
Yeah.
I think what most people are saying to themselves is, well, this is a repentance of sorts. This is solving a sin of some kind. It's not going to continue afterwards, which I think
is not the case.
Right. It's a silly assumption.
If it's a second marriage, it's your second marriage till the day you die.
Yeah.
That doesn't just go away. And like, if you've ever struggled with lust or had a weird thought, that's not just going to go away because you got married.
But we think there's a chance that gets repented. But what we've said explicitly, we actually say it explicitly or implicitly, but I've seen so many articles this week that have said it explicitly, like there is no repentance if you're deciding to go forward with this marriage, and it's one of those, marriages that every article I put in quotes. And I just want to stop there and say that's about as far as I want to go down that road for a moment. I think because I think there's something bigger going on there. In terms of just the way you see the issue, like you've made this assumption, and we're going to see that. I think one of the issues that stood out to me is how many strange assumptions people have to make to get to the positions they get to on this issue. So let's go to your Pharisee comment for a moment. When we titled this episode, Would Jesus Attend a Gay Wedding? Part of it is meant to be, of course, provocative, right? It's partly there, but also because if Jesus wouldn't, then we shouldn't. And if he would, then we would. And the question we have to ask is, well, clearly that wasn't the case in the Bible. We don't have an example of this to follow. And the closest analog that we have in the Bible is probably when Jesus spends time with Matthew and the tax collectors.
Yeah.
It's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This story where the Pharisees, again, who are so about the outward display and drawing lines. And look, I don't want to make them into cardboard cutouts. I think that they were rightly concerned about things. And they had this view that is very much like the conservative evangelicals that are, some of them are my friends and colleagues, right? That their concern is God really takes this seriously. And if we don't take it seriously, the people won't take it seriously and there will be dire consequences. Like I think about how the Pharisees thought about Sabbath. They criticized Jesus for his disciples not following the Sabbath, right? And in their mind, if you're going to be generous to them for a moment, they're thinking, look, there was a guy in the Old Testament who got stoned for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. Like God takes this Sabbath law seriously and your disciples aren't. So we're worried about that, right? Yeah, they're probably showing off how righteous they are. They're probably doing it externally, but probably somewhere inside, if you really quizzed them, you go, is this really important? They go, seemed important enough to God. We should keep it. We shouldn't relax it, right? But that attitude, Jesus tells them, is wrong. He says to them, you're wrong. Even though you might have this logical flow, like here's the Old Testament law, here's what happened, we're just maintaining it. He's like, and you're wrong. And I think today's Pharisees are exactly in the same position where they could say, look what the Bible says, look what marriage is supposed to be, look at this, look at this, look at this. And I think Jesus would turn to them and say, you're wrong. Right? You're wrong in the way you're applying it. You're wrong in the way you're understanding it, right? Just like he had to say to them, and he does, he says, you're wrong. Like, go and understand what this means. And so I think we have the same thing. Let me just look at that passage real fast. So this is from Matthew. He's saying Jesus passed on from there and he called Matthew sitting at the tax booth. And if you're not aware, like tax collectors were about the lowest on the rung you could be. I mean, there are some people who believe that even prostitutes in terms of their sin were higher up the rung than tax collectors who were seen as traitors, right? Cheats, betrayers, unclean. And so he's there. He calls as his disciple. He's not, like, talking to somebody. He's calling as one of his 12 close disciples, a tax collector. And he said to him, follow me. And of course, Matthew rises and follows him. And then immediately the next verse says, and as Jesus reclined at the table in his house, in the house of Matthew. Again, in the first century, reclining at the table is not a small thing. He's not visiting for a little lunch.
Yeah.
He's going there and he's demonstrating that he has accepted this person, right? And he's there with these other people. In the Mark version, it says that some of the tax collectors had started to follow him, right? So they were actually positively responding to him. And just being there when we're all worried, well, if I go, what are they going to think? Do they think I affirm this? Jesus is sitting in their midst, reclining at the table, showing his positive, like, closeness to them. He's actually fellowshipping with them. And this is why the Pharisees are so scandalized, because they're going to think. And he's saying, he's reclining at the table. Many tax collectors and sinners came. Why? Because Mark's version tells us because they were starting to follow him. And we're reclining with Jesus and his disciples. So this is a whole banquet of undesirables.
There's something interesting because it says that he reclined at the table in the house, but I don't imagine that this table was in like the back booth of a Denny's, like in a closed, like no window thing, because it says the Pharisees saw this.
Right.
So there had to have been something visible, and Jesus knows it's visible because the Pharisees saw this. Like, I don't think the Pharisees it doesn't say anywhere that the Pharisees broke into the house, flashed a flashlight, and said, who's meeting up here? But there was something.
They clearly were watching people come and go. So they're either watching him, or the other thing is many of these reclining events, these banquets, took place not like we do in our country, we do in the backyard. They actually
like
did
veranda
them
type,
in the front of the house, right? Like in the courtyard.
So their dining table and dining time was in the front of the house.
A lot of times they were in public view. That's the reason that people would say, like, like when Jesus say, when you invite somebody, don't do it so that people can see, invite you back. Because like the people could see
what was happening.
It's the ancient equivalent of like tagging someone in your story and seeing that you're hanging out with them. and then they repost it to make
This
sure
really-
everyone knows
this really
that they're
shows our
hanging out.
generation, because I was like, it's the equivalent of showing up at like the It restaurant in LA to
There
be
you
seen
go.
by the paparazzi,
I know.
but she's
Gen
went
X,
straight to
Millennial, Gen Z. There you go.
Yeah,
Three
it
generations.
literally is like
Instagram.
you want everyone to see that I'm hanging out with this person. I'm gonna make it really known and have their like at right here, and then they repost it to make everyone else know that I hung out
Yeah.
with so and so. So eating at the front, especially
Yeah.
socially in the ancient times, if people are walking by, there's a statement
Yeah.
you're making
And
with who you're eating
This
with.
reclining was very intimate. People leaned into each other, right?
Right.
Like this wasn't just like a distant thing. It showed that these people are family. In the first century, who you ate with signified who you hung with and
And they
belonged
actually
with.
ate reclined though, like
Yep.
like literally
Right.
relaxing and reclining and eat
for
and
long
eating.
periods of time, right? This isn't a quick like, hey, we'll stop by and have lunch with a few of your friends.
Right.
and-
Like a meeting.
Right.
This is
It's like
actually
put your
so-
purse down, kick your shoes off, and you'll be here a while.
And that's why everyone, the Pharisees especially, are see this as scandalous. So, like you said, Wisdom, when you point out, when they saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" It's not like, hey, what's his purpose? They're saying like this should not be done. Let's be clear. They're
like
not
you
like
shouldn't be seen
Yeah.
with this type of.
there isn't any answer he gives where they're like, oh, okay, well, in that case, I'd be okay. He's saying like, there is no reason that he should be doing this, right? That's what this question really is asking, right? And then, of course, Jesus responds. He says, when he heard this, he said, those who are well have no need for a physician, but those who are sick, go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. For I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled on whether he really thinks the Pharisees are righteous, or he's being ironic with the Pharisees that they're righteous, or he's just replaying to them what they think, that they think they're righteous. That doesn't really matter as much as the point that he's trying to make, which is I've come to be with those who are in need. I've come to heal those who need to be healed. That's what I've come for. And apparently you guys think you're so good. You don't need anything. So I'll just leave you where you are. But I've come specifically for the people who are in need. And by his action, he's saying, and I'm not afraid to step into that space in a way that everyone's going to be scandalized by it. And I think that's exactly what's happening when Alistair Begg says this to a grandmother, where I wouldn't even go through all the steps of like, do they know your position? Like, they know. If they're inviting you to the wedding, they know. There's no mistake.
Especially if you're the grandmother
They know. like
and not the random friend of a friend.
yeah, unless you're like somebody who's just showing up at the wedding because you're the plus one and you have nobody. Like, if you're somebody that they're inviting, they know where you stand. If you think like, well, if I go, they're not gonna wonder. They know exactly where you stand. That look on your face, that thing you've done to them so many times, that all that unsolicited advice you've given, they know. They know. And yet here, Jesus isn't going there and saying, now I'm only coming here on this one condition. You all need to understand what I'm here for. He's actually at the table, coming close, spending time with people, and people are turning to him.
It's not even like he's making a statement. He is making a statement, but I love this. I'm trying to think through now. The statement he's making is, I associate with you. Maybe it's not does like he condone whatever, we could go to the old law, but I associate with you. Let it be known. I, Jesus, the Messiah, Son of God, I associate with someone like you. And I want everyone to see that.
I love the statement in here that it's really they're reclined at the table with Jesus. Like Jesus has come into a place where he's the guest and he's become the host. Jesus does this all the time, where he suddenly becomes the host and is not just there like sitting awkwardly in the corner like most of our like really uptight friends. He's like suddenly become the host of the event.
Who's
People
welcoming and like creating a safe space. He's saying, I'm safe for you to come to.
Yep. The Messiah has come, and this is one of those foretastes of the banqueting table that we're going to have with him, and he's having it here with them.
I just now I'm thinking through like, now what were the tax collectors thinking as the Messiah sitting with them, associating with them, and they don't have, like they don't.
I mean,
I don't think they get invited. They don't get invited to things.
They don't necessarily know he's Messiah, right? Like they could just be like, he's rabbi.
Sure.
He's a Jewish man.
Yeah,
who's
either
sitting,
way,
like
but
even that on its
But
own.
the fact that you, a human being, want to associate with me, a tax collector, I imagine they're sitting there eating. Maybe Jesus is reclining, and they're like,
because how isolated what did that group of people feel?
Yeah.
How ostracized, does it sound familiar for that community? How ostracized does that group of people feel? How isolated, how unwanted, how dirty, how unworthy. And that's just so sad. And Jesus is like, no.
That's what the Pharisees wanted them to feel. Like, that we want you to know that you're excluded. You are unclean.
And that is the point of standing up publicly, is to continue to make that, whatever communities you're standing up against, feel gross and dirty and unworthy and everything that is not what Jesus calls.
Okay, but let's give them the best possible reading. Again, they might think we need to be clear about this. We need to warn people about this. Use my Sabbath example again. Like, we need to let people know the seriousness of this. And I would say, even if that's your intent, it's not going to work, right? Like, this is what Alice said to her. He said, if you go, you might catch them off guard. Otherwise, people are going to think you're judgmental, critical, unprepared to countenance anything. And then you go and prove it.
Yeah.
You prove that you're all of those things, instead of overcoming that idea or having Jesus saying, I'm coming into your home and I'm actually becoming the host of what you're hosting.
Someone is listening to that and is like, yeah, I'm going to undercover go to this special day of these people and start witnessing and preaching and telling everyone where I stand. Don't do that. That is not what this means and what it's saying either. Because Jesus didn't go to hang out with the tax collectors and be like, and just so I'm clear, I don't think anything that you guys are doing is good. And no.
Well, that's the thing. I don't know what he said. I do know,
but if he's becoming the host, the host doesn't do that.
Right. Well, I agree. I also want to say that in his conversation with the Pharisees, he was clear, yes, I understand that the things they're doing, whether it's by cheating or being greedy or betraying their countrymen or being unclean or whatever it is they're doing, I'm not saying they're righteous, right? He's very clear, I've come for those who are not righteous, and never mind whether the Pharisees are or are not righteous.
I was going to say,
right? So he is clear, and that's one thing that we miss, because when we overcorrect the other way, what I've heard people are like, Jesus accepted everybody, Jesus did everything, Jesus never can. I'm like, no, that's not true. I don't know if they were overhearing what he said to the Pharisees, but it's clearly what he thinks. He's saying to them, I know what and what I'm doing, and I know who they are, and I know who I am, and I know who you are, and we can all sort out with all the different meanings of that. But in the end, he's not also saying that's not the way to do it at all. I don't know what he was saying to them, right? We have other examples where he's at people's houses and he tells stories to kind of really get them to think about things and change their thoughts. So maybe he did that. Maybe that's not what Matthew wanted to record. But I think it's a great lead-in to say, okay, let's move to that modern equivalent of what we're asking about in this episode. So if Jesus would dine and associate himself and scandalize the Pharisees by going to the house of a tax collector and reclining there and being there and calling one of them as his disciple, what about now? Is this the modern equivalent where if you do go to a gay wedding, are you following an example that Jesus would have done if he were here at this time? Or is there something different about it, right? Because everywhere I read is no, it's different. It's different. It's different. I'm like, what's different?
They need it to be different.
Yeah, but why?
For all the things we already said. The virtue signaling, the blaming that community for everything that's wrong with society today, for you got to know where I stand because I'm righteous and I will not even hint or associate or touch the thing that I'm against and think is, wrong and beneath me. It's all of that. It's all of that.
Do you have a different view, or is it the same? Do you think that's really what's going on?
With people saying why they don't, I think they're just a little hard gripped on that for some reason. And I think it's because, and I might have said this in another episode maybe, but we tend to, or not we, but people can tend to conglomerate, put topics all together. If you say yes to this thing, you're going to say yes to everything. And it's
yeah.
Or you're not even saying yes to anything by going to a gay wedding. I don't think that, whatever, but people have a fear of okay, well, then we're going to, I don't know, then they're going to talk about immigrants. What's your view on immigrants then? And what's your view on X, Y, and Z? And you're what? You're afraid that this comes as a package deal for all of these other kinds of things. So maybe that's why it's hard gripped and a very specific,
I think that there is a difference that we have for some reason with this issue. It seems like it's its own unique thing, but at the same time, I do think that what you're kind of hinting at is there's a fear of this slippery slope. Like once we compromise one thing, like the whole thing falls apart. But actually, I would just say that about every part of a conservative view of the faith, is that every part you feel like if I compromise one thing, and I've had those fears myself. I mean, I probably would lean more conservative theologically than most others on. So, but you always worry about that. Like, well, what if we relax this? What if we relax this? This seems to be one though that just is special for some reason. Like you said, it's a demarker of so many things. We didn't ask this before. I didn't ask you guys, like we didn't prep for this in any way. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I'll ask it. Like, do you think Jesus would go?
Yes.
You think he would go? Do you think he would go?
Yes.
Okay. I'm mostly yes. You know, like I feel nervous arguing like what Jesus would absolutely do.
You said, do I think?
Yeah. I mean, look, I leave room that I could be wrong. But based on the story that we read in all three of these gospels, like I actually believe the analog is there.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where my starting point is, like almost proof that he would is the fact that every one of these articles that I wrote, the authors would have been those Pharisees showing up
100%.
totally scandalized. It's
Yes.
almost like, yes, he would do that. But here's what I wanted to go deeper for myself. Like, okay, if I think that, if I actually think he would go.
And I don't think he'd be like going from table to table like, this is wrong though. Yeah. I also don't think that.
Because it's not the theme of Jesus to step away from the quote unquote messiness or the things that the Pharisees deem unworthy, unclean, whatever. He literally, like the Lord God himself sends his son to earth, like as a collective full of sin, full of brokenness, of a myriad of things, and he goes into it and becomes one of us and lives among us. So it's not the theme of Jesus himself to withdraw from humanity,
to be far away,
to be far from humanity. That's not him at all.
That's like the opposite.
Okay, but Jesus also was very clear about what his kingdom was like and what we needed to do in his kingdom, right? So again, I don't want to have Jesus be heard as somebody who just came to just be close to us. Like he was also calling us to repentance and calling us to the way of the kingdom, right? And giving us that path. He didn't, I mean, if Jesus came to die and forgive all sins, like that could have taken a day or two. We could have just been done, you know? But he spent so much time teaching and calling us to something and showing us the kingdom life and how it was going to transform the world if we began to live into this kingdom that's going to be ever expanding.
Yes, but not through the method of withdrawal from humanity.
Okay. I agree. Like it was directing. I agree that he was like incarnational and directly involved. I agree with those things. What I did was I was trying to read why these people who are trying to make sure that nobody could go to a wedding like this in good conscience, what was behind it. I was like reading. So here's where I put on my lawyer hat, like go get the evidence, like go read the arguments. I turn into the logician, like what are you saying?
Yes, tell us, Esquire.
Yeah, so I want to give you a couple of perspectives and see how you think of it, because you would go. I'm like, I think I would go. And I think Jesus
you'd just go to the reception.
Yeah,
at the ceremony.
No, but that's no. I mean, if I'm going to all of it.
The whole
thing.
thing.
Right. Like I'm not going to make this like I'll come and eat the food, but I'm not going to the ceremony. So there are some people who take the view that a wedding is different even than eating at somebody's house. Although I think this first century dining, reclining thing is really, really important to remember. But they would say, no, a wedding ceremony is actually a worship service, and it's a ceremony by which your attendance is an affirmation of the wedding itself. So let's make this easy for a moment. The people who are there, they're not believers. Right? The people who are there, they're having a same-sex marriage, let's say, and they're not believers, and they don't really care what you think about your faith, and they're not even following your faith. So let's just use that as an example. What do you think of that argument of like, well, but going to this thing in our society is an endorsement, and you're actually there in a ceremonial function, not just as an attendee. You're actually participating in the wedding and officiating it by being there.
Okay, two things. First of all, if they're not believers and it's not a worship ceremony, it's none of that, so that's not what you're attending. Second of all, I've never heard this in my life. Is a wedding a worship ceremony? What is this? This... No, I'm being serious. This sounds so weird to me. Am I the only Christian that's like, a wedding is a
Yeah, I knew that.
Yeah.
Is a worship service?
Yeah, you're on your own on this one, maybe. No, look, I mean, I'm going to tell you more about it because I think it's important to get where these people are coming from.
But I'm thinking about the way they used to marry before and in the old... And
say that. How would they used to marry before?
No, I mean, I never viewed it as a worship service. It was like the joining of two lives and like, but
like ceremonial, like that's what worship service meaning.
But this is what's so fascinating to me about this.
Please explain more because I don't. And there are probably, I'm now representing, hi guys, if you're with me, and this sounds weird, and I've been a Christian my whole life, and I literally studied religion, and I've never heard that biblically speaking, like, yes, I know people might have that idea, and I've been to ceremonies, this might be unpopular, I'm just going to say it, where all of a sudden, midway through the ceremony, maybe you can relate with me, it's literally an altar call, and it bothers me. I hate it. And I'm like, this is not the time. That is so weird. Like, you're marrying these people, and then you're like, if you don't know Jesus Christ, raise your hand now. And I'm like, what? Like, I don't like it. And I've not, so please explain. Is this a biblical thing? And I don't know how I feel about it.
So first, let me explain the position. The position is by attending the wedding, you're participating in a ceremonial function. First of all, so even worship service aside, you're officiating by being there.
Yes.
You might not be the officiant, but that a wedding is somehow different because of this whole view.
Right. And marriage is really a religious idea.
Right. So the view is that, you know, like in the old language, when someone says, like, if there's anyone here who objects to this wedding, speak now or forever hold your peace. The only reason that's spoken to the crowd is because they are not just attending, they are there as witnesses and officiants as well. And if somebody did object, there's stories of people saying, okay, hold on.
Make sure the bride's the right bride.
Yeah, or somebody like she's still married to me. I've heard stories about that where somebody's like, what? You know, like, and then they stop the wedding and they go talk about it to figure out what's going on.
The worship thing. I get the ceremony, like you're
maybe
witnessing.
It's the terminology that's like throwing you off.
It's the terminology for sure, because I don't know what that means. Like, does that mean going to a wedding is to worship God? Or is it a ceremony before the Lord that you invite him into, obviously, this union? But I don't understand.
Well, certainly if they're not believers, we're not adding in the worship part, right?
That's very interesting. So maybe because I'm thinking like singing, and what you're saying is like...
We've clearly freaked Monique out on this one, you know. So
this is the first thing I've heard where I'm like, that's weird.
But I like that you were starting with the Bible, because this is what I think is most interesting about this is when I read all of these kind of evangelical Protestant scholars, every one of them was making an argument from tradition, not from the Bible. And the reason it's so interesting to me is because that is what they criticize all day long that Catholics do, that they go, well, here's the Bible and here's all the tradition of the church, and they're on equal parlance. So we can use from different parts of it. And of course, Protestants and especially evangelicals are like, that's wrong. You can't do that. But in this argument, one person after another. I read all these articles. And where are these traditions? Because if you go back to the Bible, how did people get married in the Bible? They didn't even have ceremonies. They actually slept together. Right? That's what happened.
And then pulled the sheet out and hung it outside.
like how did Jacob get tricked into marrying Leah, right? It was because it was dark in the tent. It wasn't because she was like veiled. It was just dark. They had sex, and in the morning...
But then that's not even before people. So what's this whole witness thing?
Well, that's what I'm saying. So if you're arguing from this, like, hey, you guys are officiants and you're witnesses and all these things... It means that we're arguing from tradition, right? We're going back to a time where somebody's like, and I wanted to know what time that was. So like, it turns out that in church history, in the Catholic Church, you didn't even need to have a priest officiate a wedding. So whether there were ceremonies or not, the priest wasn't even involved till like the 1500s, right? In the Protestant tradition, like in Anglicanism, there wasn't even like a priest or a rector or whatever it is until like the 1700s. And so when you say like, well, but there's this part of
it couldn't just be the sex.
Huh?
It couldn't just because kings had concubines, and there was a time where they were like, no, you can't, because you're literally throwing these women away back to culture. Right. They're looked down upon. They're untouchable. They will starve. And so the king was told, like, you cannot do this. If you're taking these women, you have to make them your wives so that they're protected. So I know this might sound super archaic and very patriarchal to most people listening, but it's actually quite a revolutionary thing where we're like, you're not using women and just throwing them out. So it is a step in the right direction. At least call them a wife, or at least give them the rights of wifehood. So it can't just be sex, because then automatically every person is a wife.
Right. But in our tradition of following from the Old Testament forward to Christianity, like the idea that there was a ceremony isn't mentioned anywhere, right? That was something that developed, and it developed pretty late. So that when people are saying, wait a minute, when you go to a wedding, it's different because you're participating, because you should object. Like these things happen in the last 300 or 400 years, right? These new kind of thing. And you say, and again, I was like, so you're getting it from the Bible? No, you're not. You're getting it from tradition, which normally you reject. Here's another argument I heard from some of these guys. They were like, well, weddings are a sacrament. Like, in the Catholic Church, there's 7 sacraments. In the Protestant Church, there's only 2, and marriage is not one of them. And you guys are very clear about that all the time, about there's only 2,
but
there's
all of
only
us,
2.
no, they're Catholic now.
But suddenly when you get into this issue, everybody's suddenly a Catholic, right?
Yeah.
And I look,
It's interesting.
I was born Catholic. I respect the Catholic traditions
sure.
and faith, right?
Yeah.
Love you, Catholic.
Right?
Yes,
But
yeah.
the people
Shout out
that I'm
Catholics.
reading don't.
Don't. And have something to say about it. And yet, all of a sudden it's a sacrament.
Yep. Suddenly it's a sacrament.
It's the hypocrisy we're pointing out, not the anti-Catholicism.
So there is a great way to be a Pharisee, to borrowing from other people's traditions when you need to make up the rule that you want to get to no matter what, and come up with these things. And I'm just calling that out to say that is really the hardest part to bear. And that's what confused me this week, is people that I respect, that I follow, that are trying to make these arguments. I saw them contorting themselves into pretzels, trying to figure out a way to say this is different. And this isn't just recent. I went back and found articles going back 10, 20 years, trying to make the same arguments. And I'm saying, look, guys, it doesn't hold up. The argument doesn't hold up. Give me a better one. Give me something different. But if this is what we're hanging it on, it does sound like it goes against the scripture. You made up marriage into a special category that didn't exist. And then you cited it, and you don't even believe it, 6 days out of 7 when you're talking about your fellow brethren in the Catholic Church. You don't believe those things, but now you believe them. Like now they're suddenly sacramental,
convenient.
right? And it is kind of convenient. And it just brings me back to like, this is why that was so hard, because I'm just so bummed. Like it's so hard to countenance this and think this is really what we've come to, is a place where we're going to make people feel so excluded over and over and over. And we don't have great biblical grounds for doing it. In fact, it seems to me that when Jesus says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, most of us really, they're like, nope, I like sacrifice because it's external and people can see it.
I'll give something up. I'm giving up going to this thing so that, why don't you just go and extend grace and mercy to people?
Have a piece of cake.
And what would mercy look like? Like, what would that look like? I think that's what Alistair was trying to say to her. Like, go and take a gift, right? Go and surprise them with your grace and your mercy. Like, just
show
go,
love.
right, and do that. And it seems like
that was my favorite part of his quote.
Yeah.
Go and bring a gift.
And bring a
like,
gift.
Bless them and be there.
A lot of Christians love like the idea of free will, and it's used to like talk about all sorts of things. Free will, free will, free will. Well, if this couple by their own free will is engaging in this, like that's their choice, you can still respect it and show some grace and show some love and show some mercy.
Yeah. I mean, imagine if we followed this through all the way, like you were talking about, like we'd have to quiz everybody down and say like our premarital counseling would change completely. Like, oh, you're living together? Are you repentant?
No,
about
I
living
literally
together?
know someone who was on a worship team at a huge church, living with her boyfriend, sleeping with her boyfriend for years up there.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's
And
crazy.
then finally was like, okay, I feel guilty about it. Let's just go get married real quick, like at the church, so we can say that we're like fine. And they're happy. I don't know if they'll ever see this. I'm not trying to guilt. I'm just pointing out that like no one is perfect. And again, sanctification is a lifelong thing. And Jesus knew it. He's like, I'm having dinner with you today because this probably isn't the same person you're going to be tomorrow and the day after and the day after. And we don't trust God to move. And we don't trust to just show up and show the love and the grace and the mercy. And if you are invited into a conversation that requires your opinion, great if you have a relationship. Otherwise, just show the love, who Christ is, and like trust that God will do what God needs to do.
And you won't have a relationship if you just say, I'm not going. I need you to understand how I feel about this. And you're like, okay, good. You've cut off that relationship. And that's not the best reason. I want to be clear. Like, there's a lot of times where we have to just say, all right, look, I have to be clear about something and it may cost me, and I'm sorry it may cost me, right? But in this particular, you gain nothing out of it, right? Nobody is confused about how you feel, right? Everyone knows how you feel, and you showing up is going to only show love and mercy, and they're not going to be at all confused. It's not going to happen. I've been to weddings that are of a man and a woman where I knew that this wasn't right. I've been to those. Nobody has ever said to me, like, you need to not go to that, right? Because you're inefficient, because this is sacramental, because no, they're like, you go and you just do whatever, because we can forgive all of those things, whatever they are. Like, and you look at them and you go, I know these people. They should not be getting. There's stuff going on right now. Like, even while I'm here watching this, thinking this is a disaster, and there I am smiling, and doing it. But at the same time, like, what was the other thing? Is to say, no, I object to this. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to be part of this. Yep, I think that's exactly what Jesus might say to me. Like, you need to understand mercy, and not sacrifice. Like, go and learn what that means.
Yeah, people go to weddings all the time where there's been red flags for years.
Yeah.
And you happily go and you eat your cake and you...
I think the human element of this is there's no way to overstate it. Like, I've been asked this question directly several times and it's been a grandmother, by the way. Almost every time it's a grandmother. Almost every time.
Maybe this episode's just for the grandmothers.
Yeah, almost every time it's been a grandmother. And so when I read this, it reminded me. I remember right after I preached the sermon, this woman came up and she told me the same thing. And I said to her, this is 10 years before this happened. I'm like, do they know where you stand? Yeah. So then I think you're free to go, right? They're not going to be confused, right? They're just going to see you as part of the family, loving them, right? It's not like they're going to be, I wonder.
Is that the requirement, though? Because I feel like someone is going to listen to this and say, okay, well, these are the steps. Make sure you write them a letter or tell them that you don't agree with it in any kind of way, and then you can show up.
I'm not saying that's the requirement.
Okay.
I'm actually not even saying there's a way to do it. I was just asking, like, look, if they know...
And
then
still
there's
invited
no reason for you not to. Like, there isn't a reason, because, like, there is not even the
If they don't know, then what?
Yeah, I would.
Then you're like, me not going is them finally finding out? No.
No. Yeah.
So first of all, if they don't know, I think that's a different issue, because first of all, why are they inviting somebody that they don't even know how they feel about something, right? That either means that you've just not said
And by the way, I
anything.
mean this for any marriage. Like, if they don't know how you feel about the relationship, be it homosexual, heterosexual, whatever. Like,
yeah, nobody's asking that question.
Yeah.
I've been invited to a wedding that should not have happened. And there definitely was infidelity before it and the whole nine. And I'm sitting there like at this wedding, and nobody asked me, especially when you have 200 guests, well, how do you feel about our relationship? Because I need to know before you come and I invite you. So that doesn't make sense to me, because we don't even do that for any other.
So then what's your advice then, if they don't know how you feel about?
I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is it's the cowardice in me that hasn't come to somebody and said, you guys should not be doing this. Not at the wedding, of course, like before. Like when I first.
In the card.
Right, like not. And
I've also had those conversations,
you know.
but again, only when I had a different wedding now, a really, really close friend a very, very long time ago, who I literally like almost all the way up into was like, if you really don't want to do this, but I earned this spot in this person's life, like you don't have to, because like there's these issues and I know you know what these issues are, and maybe this thing caught wheels and it's like a snowball that keeps, and you feel like you can't stop it, but like you can. And I think that's different, but if you go through with it, I will be there with you. And they did, and I went, and they're still married, and it's not great, but yeah. So
I think there's like two scenarios that they wouldn't know. One is I'm so far away from them, like why would they know, and why would they even care what I think? Like I am literally the friend of a friend or whatever. I just got invited because I was with someone who's going to the wedding and I showed up, right? And then what does it care what sure. I think, right? And I know there's some people are like, it's public. They'll see you there. They'll be like, yep. And they saw Jesus reclining with the tax collectors. Like it's the same thing. They'll see me and it might even cause a question like, what are you doing here? And I'd be happy to explain, right? The other one is you're close to them and they don't know. And that means like I haven't been truthful if I really object to something. Like if I think, oh, you know, you and her, like, like you guys shouldn't really be together, or because of all the history in the past. But it doesn't matter. Like they're going to do what they're going to do. And they probably, and I would say I should have done it before I go, not to think, oh, but my presence there will somehow make a difference. Like the fact that you never said anything was part of your responsibility to a friend to say, I don't think this is a good idea that you do this. Right. I don't know. That's where I would land on those two things. I just don't think it makes any difference when someone is inviting you, then you say, okay, I'm coming. And you say, but I object to this. Like, what have you gained? Like, what has happened? Right. They either know where you stand or they don't. But like, what new has come out of any of that? Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's where it lands. And I think that's the harder part of this issue is there's grace to all those people. That's why I'm, at the end of the day, I'm kind of sad, because I think that we are missing out on that. We're so busy drawing those lines. We're so busy like making sure that everybody understands where we stand as opposed to how we love. And that is the travesty part, because I don't know if Jesus had said to the tax collectors, you know what, I'll come over, but you need to stop tax collecting for me to do it. I need you to stop tax collecting and tell me that this is the last day you collect taxes, and I'll come and recline at your table. Like,
he didn't.
It doesn't do that. Like,
no,
like
he
everyone,
went.
Right? We don't say it to anybody else. Like, we don't say to somebody who's addicted in some way, like, you need to stop the addiction, then you can come to Jesus, right? I don't even know that we say to cohabitating couples, you need to stop that, then you can come to Jesus, right? We don't say it in any way.
Or the cohabitating couple that already knows Jesus.
Like, yeah, like you need to stop that, and or you can't, you're not really following Jesus. And they go, but we earnestly are following Jesus. We're just, not following him in this area. Like, well, that means you're not following him. That's the part that I think is so dangerous, because we make ourselves the gatekeepers of who's in and who's out. Jesus is the gate. He is the gate. He says he is the gate, right? And we put ourselves in these positions where we're trying to say, not only that I want you to know where I stand, but I want to make sure you know where you stand, and you're on the other side of that line, and you are not welcome in until you discontinue this behavior. But it seems almost inescapable that this one is the one that we enforce the most. And it just breaks my heart that we can't show mercy. We want to always offer the externals above everything else.
Yeah. And I'm sure y'all heard a lot of sighing on this side through this whole conversation. And it's a hard one for me, because like you said, it's heartbreaking. And it's not just heartbreaking that people that would claim to know Jesus would act this way, or that this has become a tradition, or all the messiness of how Christianity has been associated with this type of virtual signaling. And like you said, gatekeeping, like we want to keep certain people out of the faith, and like whatever that is. But and I've said it, I think on definitely more than one podcast, it's just, my heart breaks for this particular community, because they've just suffered so much at the hands of Christians, and have been so persecuted and so judged. And I just know someone's watching this, it's part of that community, and they're like, I hear what you're saying, it's great, you'd come to my wedding, but someone's used that verse up there, and they say, who needs a physician? The sick. And they're saying, I'm sick. And this is where my mind goes, right? Where I look at that and I'm like, no, it's just like Jesus brings healing. Like, it's healing. It could be emotional healing of the heart. And whatever that means for your lifetime of sanctification, where the Holy Spirit leads you, like, I believe wherever you are, whoever you are, whatever community, Jesus loves you. He calls you where you're at, and you can go on that journey and see what the Lord does with that. But my heart breaks. Whoa, I'm actually getting emotional because they're really hurt.
Yeah.
And we have screwed that community over, and someone is part of LGBTQ watching this, and it's not good enough, because what they're hearing is, I'm sick and I'm this and I'm that. And like, we don't do that with any other state of our hearts.
Well, but we should, because that's what we said on a different podcast when I made the statement to say that we are all broken. That's the thing.
Right.
That I am a sinner, and I am the one that Jesus came for as well. We're not putting ourselves in a category where, like, oh, in this case, the people who attend the wedding, but they come from a heterosexual background, like they're the righteous, right? No, when I go into anybody's wedding, in the back of my mind, and I mean this honestly, there's a check that thinks, am I doing something wrong by being here because of the sinful life that I have? Am I somehow polluting this place by being in the midst of these people? Like, Jesus is saying, like all. Like that in this case, he's letting the Pharisees off the hook by saying, oh, you think you're righteous, so I'm going to let you consider yourselves in that category. But the Bible is pretty clear that we are all broken. We are all sinners. We're all in need of healing. And we're not drawing those lines. I don't. And that's the thing is I hang my head low all the time when I consider the depth of my sin and the depth of my need. But I hear what you're saying too, because somebody's like, no, you need to love yourself and affirm yourself and say there's nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with anybody. Like that would be the American culture. That's not Jesus. Like that is not Jesus. Jesus actually took a long time to explain all the ways that we're broken and fall short of his standard,
like
right?
the point is that they're not less than.
Right.
Your community is not less than.
No, we're the same. And that's what grieves me is when I read people trying to make these distinctions and twist themselves into pretzels and borrowing arguments they would never make in any other area. They would never accept in any other area to continue to make sure that we understand that this is unlike everything else.
And it's just so hateful and it's so ugly. And I want to also challenge, if you are a Christian, even if you're a conservative Christian, the three of us here have we're so different. And sometimes you can tell and sometimes you can't, right? Because again, the Bible is the thing that unites us and what we agree on. We're so different. So however it is that you feel about that, you need to consider the state of your heart. When you hear about that community, do you feel angry? Do you feel disgust? Do you look down on, like they're less than you, like they don't deserve to be in a church or know the Lord? Do you feel more called to shout out against publicly more than any other thing, even though you've got stuff going on? Because that's a good sign that your heart is not being transformed in the way that the Holy Spirit and Christ calls us to be transformed. And I am not in this moment talking about accept it as a sin and not a sin. I want to make that clear. I'm not talking about what you think the Bible says about it. I'm talking about how you treat people, how you view them. And even if you don't say it with your words, you know deep inside if you feel something gross and look down on, there's something ugly happening. Challenge yourself, because you don't necessarily have to change how you feel about that thing to change how you treat humans.
Okay. Wisdom, tell me about Gen Z before we close out. Like, if they were listening to this conversation, because they're probably like, I didn't know any of this. I don't know what's going on. Like, what's all this? And then Jesus went to a tax collector's house? What? So like most of the time when I'm talking to Gen Z, like everything's brand new. Everything's like for the first time.
We need to read more, you guys.
It's all like brand new. But tell me, when they listen in on this conversation, can you channel for me like how they feel? Are they just like, I'm out. This is crazy. Like, I just can't even stomach this. Like, where do they land on this?
I think the idea of we're all broken is hard to swallow. Is a pill that's hard to swallow in our culture. And I love that, Monique, you were like, there's people gonna look at this verse and be like, so I'm sick. I want to be very careful with that. But there is we're in a culture that very much affirms the self. And that's a swing from a place of where
it's almost self-idolatry.
We're a generation that's swinging from one that neglected the self, that neglected the study of the mind and mental health and value of self and raising a voice and elevating voices that were for many, many, many years silenced, right? So now it's the swing to the pendulum the other way. So now we're a culture that overcorrectedly worships, affirms the self. So this message that we're a broken humanity is strange. And I would even say the church has failed to even communicate that well too, because even in the American church, we're affirming the self and affirming
that's
God
so
and the
true.
self.
It's so self-helpy. It's so do you think it would be easier for Gen Z to accept we're all broken if they didn't see the church saying, actually, these people are even a little bit more broken than like if it was like an even playing field of brokenness?
My experience would be hard no matter what. They just don't like it. Just doesn't sound right.
Yeah. I mean, and the way that I
I
try to communicate it to peers and even younger than I is, it is so let's zoom out of yourself and this one person, this person, whatever, and look at the news right now and the collective of humanity and what we are capable of doing and the damage we're doing as a world, right? And then suddenly it's easy, like, oh, then the human race is twisted because Gen Z cares about justice. Gen Z cares about reform. Gen Z cares about the marginalized. So when you zoom out, suddenly, I think
that's such a good point.
That's a great leeway for Gen Z to be like, oh, we're freaking broken.
That's such a good point.
So so for Gen Z, if you keep seeing these broken systems and broken organizations and broken ways of life, the Bible's been saying that. Like, that's been the problem since Genesis. And
Jesus
now we're
trying
seeing
to
that.
overturn what we think about that.
So
and
maybe if you're afraid to hear or it harms you and shames you in a way of you're broken, maybe a better way to look at it is like we as a human race are in need of a savior and collectively broken and need mending and reconciliation. And if you look at it that way and not so much this like, you only alone are broken or you only alone are not broken and you're more non-broken than this person. Whoa. Zoom out. Like, look at the human race and then suddenly you can recognize that you're in need of, we are in need of a savior.
That's like, to me, it's like almost like the root of evil. Like, we'll say, oh, it's money. The root, that saying, the root of evil to me is that self-centeredness. It's that original Satan sin of elevating himself to the status of God. It's like this thing we don't know what we're doing. And what you said provided me so much clarity because it's easier to accept the world is broken than I am. So I can zoom out and look at, you can look at humanity and see how bad it's been and what we've done and wars and whatever. Yeah. But when it comes to ourselves, we don't know how to break the ego. Yeah. And we don't know how to take entitlement. Like, we're not like stripping yourself of entitlement, stripping yourself of ego, like really being reflective of, which is what therapy is great for.
And denial. Like we want to live just knowing that we're good.
Because it makes and again, not the overcorrection of being self-deprecating, whatever, and like low self-esteem.
It's almost like a problem that both conservatives and progressives have. Of this lack of ability to see we are all.
Yes, and to be like, okay, I'm not gonna like beat myself with the whip, but let's be introspective. I need to strip myself of pride and all these things.
Yeah.
I'm glad you went there, Wisdom, because I think that's where I wanted to end this episode, is really to say, be careful. As I started the episode, be careful. Don't turn this into a litmus test. Yeah. Pharisees are on both sides of the aisle. There are the Pharisees that want to draw conservative lines and make sure who's in and who's out, but there are just as many progressive Pharisees
100%.
Who need to know that everything's okay, everything's affirmed, everything's included, there are no lines, and both of them would not follow Jesus. That's not how he came to express his kingdom or ask us to follow him. So be careful. Don't turn this episode into a referendum on either the show, your views, your friends. Don't listen to this episode saying, oh, so-and-so needs to hear this. Don't listen to it on behalf of someone else. Listen to it on your own behalf, which is we all tend to become Pharisees at some point, and we're all wrong. And I will come with humility in this episode and say, there are parts of this episode where I probably got something wrong. And there are parts of this episode where maybe we got some things wrong. Yeah. And at the resolution of all things, Jesus might say, come here. Let me tell you a couple of things. I mean, you got some things right. And there were a couple of things that I just think your own perspective blinded you to see what I was actually trying to teach. I think he's going to do that with everyone.
Everything and everyone.
Right. I think that's there. So what we're trying to do here is to earnestly do a couple things to recognize this issue, deal with it seriously, strip away the baloney reasons, but still come at the end of it and say, we're humble and we're grieved and we're concerned and we want to love and we're trying to learn how to do it. And maybe you'll help us by giving us your comments, which I'm sure there may be many, and we might address some of them in future episodes the way that we do from time to time when we get thoughtful comments to respond back. But this is all a journey we're on, and what we're trying to do is peel apart all the cultural elements from what Jesus wanted, and so that we can follow him, and we're all trying to do that. This is Jesus versus America.
Follow us on all social media platforms at Jesus versus America. And find more resources on our official website, jesusversusamerica.com.